Good day, stat students. So today we're going to go over chapters 5 and 6. And yeah, I'm going to go over 5 and 6 all together in one shot. There's a lot of stuff in chapters 5 and 6. I'm just going to hit the highlights. Now, if you plan on doing research, I would read chapters 5 and 6. It's a lot of good information, but it's more information that than I should go over because I just don't have time to go over everything that's in there. We have other things that we need to accomplish in the semester. So, all right. So, what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about different ways of gathering data. So, either you can conduct a study, and a study it can be either that you run an experiment or that you do an observational study. Okay, we're going to go over both of those. And then, if you cannot run an experiment or an observational study, okay, uh, you might want to go ahead and do a sample instead. And a sample, I'm not saying that the sample is the worst thing to do, okay? Um, I'm just saying that, you know, if you can't run if you don't want to run an experiment, you can't run an experiment because of the situation, and you can't run and do an observational study because of the situation might just call for running a sample instead, okay? All right, so let's talk about an experiment. So now I was watching TV 3, 4, 5 years ago. I don't know how long, and Bayer Aspirin had a commercial. And the makers of Bayer Aspirin said, if you take a low dosage of aspirin daily, uh, that could potentially prevent a heart attack. So now, why can the makers of Bayer Aspirin say that? Okay, so we're going to eventually go over those things with you. Okay, now the first instance of this was back in 1980. First time that they ran an experiment with regards to aspirin and potentially preventing a heart attack. It's back in 1980, and 22,000 physicians were actually the subjects. Those were the people that were actually getting the aspirin. And so let me just read this. It says in 1980, over 22,000 physicians participated in an experiment regarding whether taking a low dose of aspirin daily. So the aspirin uh, was the main treatment, what we're going to call the main treatment. Uh, so taking a low dose of aspirin daily lowered the chance of getting a heart attack. That's the response variable, getting a heart attack or not. About half were randomly chosen to get the aspirin, the other half a placebo. The researchers determined that the aspirin group had a significantly lower percentage of heart attacks than the placebo group. Okay, so we're going to run through the particulars here. One, the response variable, like I said, was getting a heart attack. Now you can think of this still as a response and explanatory. So you can think of the explanatory as either getting aspirin or placebo. But a lot of times when you run an experiment, people like to call these treatments. And there's the main treatment, and okay, so on and so forth. And so the treatments here would be either getting an aspirin or placebo. And I have to stress this is that this was randomly done. This is important. Okay, I'll show you why this was important later. And what was determined was that 44% fewer heart attacks happened in the aspirin group versus the placebo group. And because an experiment was done, um, this is why Bayer Aspirin can say what they did. Okay. Let's get into the particulars here. The why was this an experiment? What exactly did it show? So on and so forth. Okay. So what made this an experiment? I have to stress this here. Okay. We should slow down a little bit. I have to stress this because when the physicians were assigned to a group, remember the physicians were the subjects. When they were randomly assigned to get these, uh, they they didn't choose themselves. Okay, so they did not. The subjects didn't say, okay, well, I'll take the aspirin, I'll take the placebo. No, 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 that did not happen. Okay, they were randomly assigned. Okay, and because the researchers randomly assigned treatments to the subjects, this is what makes this an experiment: is the randomization and nothing else. Okay, now I have to throw some caution to the wind here. Many researchers that always have people in the experiment think that a control group is necessary in every experiment. Uh, Now, here's the thing, is that if you always have people, okay, you're probably going to have a control group. Okay, so like sociologists, they're always going to work with people. All right, and so they're always going to probably have a control group, okay? But that's not what makes an experiment, okay? All right. What makes an experiment is because of the randomization, okay, of subjects to the different treatments, okay? So for an example, a researcher might run an experiment at different temperatures, okay? And what I mean by that is that maybe they have a chemical engineer or some sort of engineer has some sort of material, and they want to know its breaking point under different temperatures. Okay, well, there's really no set control group there. Maybe they already know what the breaking point is for uh, ambient, you know, but what is an ambient temperature? You know, what is always the outside? There isn't any. Okay, and so maybe they know what it is for normal conditions at 70 degrees, okay? But I won't necessarily call that the control group, okay? That's just a particular temperature, okay? And so, um, and so the, because of the randomization is what makes this an experiment. And that's what's key to any experiment, okay? So what were the researchers trying to achieve by the randomization? So uh, what happened here was that we have the 22,000 subjects. All right. Now, what we're going to pretend is that we already know something about these people. Now, we have to do a little pretending in order to understand what's going on. What we're going to pretend is that we already going to pretend to know that 2% of them are going to get a heart attack. Okay, just so I can prove my point here. Okay, so we're going to assume that we already knew that. All right. So then we took the 22,000 subjects and broke them out into the different groups. Okay. We got the aspirin group, we got the placebo group. Okay. Now this is key. All right. By doing the randomization, all right, um, and before the subjects get the aspirin, what we're expecting is that if there was 2% of all the physicians that were going to get a heart attack, we're going to get about 2% over here. And in the placebo group, we're going to get about 2% that would get a heart attack over here. And that's if we just separated them into groups, okay, but didn't give them any treatments. That's what we're trying to achieve. So the researchers want the groups to be the same regarding heart attack, meaning the response variable before they get the treatments. They need them to look roughly the same. This is achieved with randomization. We could show mathematically, okay, we got 22,000 subjects. If we did this randomly, that it's very hard to get a lot of people, okay, over in this group or this group that are going to have a lot more heart attacks, okay? Mathematically, we can show these are probably going to be roughly the same just about no matter how you mix the people up, okay? And so we have those confounding or lurking variables, which I'm just going to say they're roughly the same thing here. So we have things like genetics, diet, exercise, stress. These are all things that go into people getting a heart attack, right? Well, we don't expect the people who have bad genetics, uh, uh, don't exercise, have poor diet, have a lot of stress to be all in one group, basically, and very little in the other group, okay? And so this will probably not happen if randomization occurred. Is that so without any treatment, we would not expect, say, 5% over here and 1% over here. I'm sorry for the flashing there. So we would not expect 5% over here and 1% over here. Okay, this is probably not going to occur. Okay, mathematically, it would be very challenging for that to happen. What will probably occur is the following. Again, I'm sorry for the flickering there. So if we had 2% here, okay, in total, we expect roughly 2% here and we expect roughly 2% here. Okay, so if we got 2% in total, we expect those groups to be roughly 2% before getting any treatment. Okay, and again, we achieve that because of the randomization, because those lurking / confounding variables are being mixed up between these groups. Okay. All right, so let's move on. So let's say we went ahead and separated our two groups. Okay, we did that. Treatments are now administered. Okay, they're now administered. And the potential confounding / lurking variables are accounted for because of the randomization. And if there exists a significant difference in the percentage that got a heart attack in the groups, it's caused because now of the difference in the treatments between the groups. So we had 44% less heart attacks in the aspirin group. Okay, and why did that occur? Well, because it's not because we had too many people in the placebo group that had the chance of getting a heart attack before the treatments. No, that did not probably happen. Okay, probably did occur is because of the difference in aspirin and placebo. Okay. By the way, with any experiment, this should be able to be replicated. Okay. And so actually people sat back and said, there's a problem with this. Okay, with the very first one. Okay, and there was a bit of a problem. Back in 1980, okay, as you might suspect, most physicians were male and white. Okay, and so they sat back and said, we got to do this on all the different groups. And so they did. So researchers went back, maybe not the same researchers, but maybe different researchers, said, we're going to replicate this, okay, and see if we come out with roughly the same results, but on different groups. And this has happened over and over and over again. And every single time they keep coming up with the same thing, is that the aspirin group is getting lower heart attacks than the placebo group. Okay, so it can be replicated. Okay, now if an experiment is conducted properly, the researcher then can establish cause and effect. This is important. Okay, this is an important aspect of an experiment. Okay, meaning the explanatory variable, or if you want to say the treatments, the aspirin versus placebo, cause the difference in the groups regarding the response variable. Okay, and so this was the cause, was the difference between aspirin and placebo. So if you take a daily aspirin, your chance of getting a heart attack decreases. Okay, let's move on. There's a lot to experiments. Okay, like I said, if you want to read into it, you can read more into it, okay, in chapter 5, but we're going to move on here. Let's say that you cannot run an experiment and you have to run an observational study. So even though researchers may want to run an experiment, there are circumstances that won't allow it to happen. For instance, one is money, two is time. Okay, now you can imagine both of these. It takes a lot of money, you know, especially let's say that you're a medical researcher and it costs, I don't know, $50,000 extra to bring in one extra person. And yes, that may actually be the case because there might be getting experimental treatment, drugs, I don't know, costs for transportation, lodging, things like that. Okay, and so it takes a lot of time to do this. Okay, so if you don't have the money, you don't have the time. Okay, you may have to run an observational study. But one other reason why you might have to run an observational study is because of ethics. Okay, and I want to slow down here a little bit and explain this one because I think the first two is obvious. Okay, so I was driving into work one day and something actually made me chuckle a little bit. And what made me chuckle was the fact that the person on the news made it sound like an experiment was run with regards to vasectomy and prostate cancer. He said that that there was a higher instances of people men who had a vasectomy and getting prostate cancer. Okay, fine. Okay, but he made it sound like an experiment was run, that there was cause and effect, and it made me chuckle. because this was obviously not the case. Okay. Now, why wasn't the case? Let's have a little bit of fun with this. Okay. Let's say that this was run as an experiment and a blind study was done. Now, what is a blind study? A blind study is when the subjects have no idea what treatments they're getting, and that's usually going to be the case. Okay, you're not going to be told if you're getting, like, say, the aspirin or the or the placebo. Here, okay, if we could find some men who would volunteer to either have a vasectomy or not, we could potentially run a blind study. Okay, by the way, a double blind study is when the researcher doesn't even know, but here the researchers would absolutely have to know. So let's say that we ran this as a blind uh, experiment. Okay, so think about what would have to happen then. Okay, if we're going to run this as an experiment, we would have to bring these men in. We would not tell them if they were getting a vasectomy or not. Okay, when we were done. So obviously that has ethical implications there. Okay, but we'll continue. So what we would have to do is we would have to put them on an operating table. We would have to kind of cover up what we were doing, not show them what they were doing, what we were doing. We would give them some anesthesia, local anesthetic, and then we would make two slits, and you can imagine where the two slits are going to happen. And then the medical researcher would have to go in there and either cut the vas deferens tubes or not. Okay, so either cut them or pretend to cut them. And if you cut them, then you would have to, cauterize or somehow make sure that the tubes were properly, basically uh, uh, blocked and tied. Okay, and whatever they do down there, I'm not exactly sure. Okay, uh, or you pre- not or you pretend to cut them, so you didn't cut them, and then you might fill around down there for a little bit more time. Okay, and make the two operations roughly the same amount of time. And then you would sew them up, and then you go, well, we'll see you. We'll see if you get prostate cancer. Another ethical problem. So we had all kinds of ethical issues going on here. Okay, and so you cannot run that as an experiment. So probably what happened is that men volunteered their medical records, uh, maybe even men who passed away, and then they found out, okay, for men who had a vasectomy, seems like they had a higher rate of prostate cancer. But the problem was is that you couldn't run an experiment. There was no randomization done. Okay, there was no randomization. Okay, and we don't know if there were lurking variables out there. We don't know if there's confounding variables out there. Okay, and so we don't know if these things are just mathematically linked to one another because of those other variables, or if there's truly a cause and effect. There could be a cause and effect, but we don't know that. Okay, there could be other variables in between. Okay, and so we got to be careful here. So with observational studies, researchers do not do any type of randomization. They allow people to make their own decisions, like having a vasectomy or not. Then we simply observe the response variable, prostate cancer. Okay. Because there's no randomization, we cannot assume that the confounding or lurking variables have been spread evenly between the groups. And this is important, cause and effect cannot be established with observational studies. Okay. They cannot be established. Whereas with an experiment, they can. So researchers much prefer to do um, an experiment. Okay. Now, last thing about ethics. Ethics hasn't always stopped us from running experiments, by the way. So, for an example, polio vaccination. Okay. So Jonas Salk came up with the polio vaccination, and unlike today, where we have the COVID vaccination, where we had volunteers, well, we really didn't technically have volunteers. Okay, you know what we did? Basically, had parents volunteer their children. That's some ethical problems. There's a lot of ethical problems there, right? And basically, the United States recruited first graders, second graders, third graders. Okay, and and uh, and we went ahead and did the polio vaccination experiment on kids. Don't think we would do that today. At least I hope not. Okay, I hope not. And so, uh, we shouldn't have another person like a parent say, yeah, you might somebody else can be a guinea pig. Okay, you have to be willing adult to and sign off on such things. And the researchers have the responsibility to make sure that the subjects understand exactly what's happening to them. Okay, and so if you want to find out about this, click on this link right here. It's an interesting read. Okay, I think you'll find it interesting if you have uh, more thoughts on it. Okay. All right, this is a good place to take a break if you need to. Um, so let's say that because of the circumstances, we can't run an experiment, we don't want to do an observational study, and the smart thing here is maybe just to go ahead and take a sample. Okay, so we could do it non-randomly, which is a bad idea. Okay, an example of a non-random sample would be a convenience sample. So let's say that we were in class and I said, all right, we have to take a sample, a random sample of University of Akron students. And I told everybody in the class that they had to go sample 50 University of Akron students. Now, I would suspect that there's a few students that would try their best to do a random sample. But let's be real here. Most students would not do that. What would most students do? Most students would probably turn around and ask people that were in their classes, that they live with, their friends, so they can get it done. Okay, and that would be a convenience sample. It was easy to find people. Okay, so the people that you take classes with, that you live with, that you are friends with, are generally like what you. Okay, not to say that you are not important. It's just that we don't want 50 students who are just like you. We need a good mix of people. Okay, we need a good sample that represents the entire University of Akron population. Okay, so that would be an example of a convenience sample. How about things that were how about a random sample? Well, we take random samples. Now, why do we do this? We take random samples to avoid personal bias. Okay, to avoid, and it may not even, what, it may not even be personal bias, just bias in general. You may not even realize that you are introducing bias uh, into your sample. Okay, but if you do it randomly, okay, you lower the chances of creating any true bias. Okay, and so bias basically is that we underrepresent or overrepresent the population somehow in the sample. Okay. Uh, when I mean, I should restate that. Either underrepresent or overrepresent a group, okay, that is in the population, and they're underrepresented or overrepresented in the sample, okay. And so we have these. Usually, we have different groups of people, okay, that act a certain way, and we don't want to underrepresent or overrepresent them in our sample, okay. And that's what happens when you take a bias sample, okay. Sorry, I kind of stumbled over that one. All right, so now what are the different random samples that we can take? We can take a simple random sample, which is often called an SRS. We can take a stratified one, we can take a cluster one, or we can take a systematic one. Okay, let's go through these. Oh, and before we do this, by the way, we'd rather have a small sample versus a large non-random bias sample. So there's a real life example with regards to this. So it has to do with FDR. FDR was running against a guy named, I think it was Langdon or Landon, something like that. And and so a magazine went ahead and sampled their uh, subscribers, and they also got a hold of people who had a car and also who had a telephone. Now, I got to take you back in time here. FDR, when FDR was running and this election was going on, this was during the Great Depression. And so if you had a magazine, if you had a telephone, if you had a car, you had money, okay? And FDR was planning on taxing people who had a fair amount of money. And when I say tax, it was going to be a high tax. So anybody who had money was not going to vote for FDR. Okay. Now, this group here, this magazine group, collected over 1 million observations. Okay. But it was totally um, biased. okay, totally overrepresented the group that had a fair amount of money, okay? And so that was a huge problem, okay? And so what they did was that they put those results in their magazine, and they said uh, uh, the Republican candidate was going to get over 60% of the votes, and that person was going to win in a landslide. When the actual election tally came in, it was exactly the opposite. FDR actually got like about 2/3 of the votes. Okay, and it was completely wrong. Their sample. Why? Because it was biased. And it doesn't matter if there was a million observations, over a million observations. It doesn't matter. If it's biased, it's not going to be a good one. It's not going to represent the population, and you should not use it. Okay. All right. Let's talk about a simple random sample. So every sample the same size has exactly the same chance of being selected as the sample to represent the population. So imagine being in class, okay, and you had 50 students in class, and I said, just pick 5 people, okay? Pick 5 people, all right? And I said, okay, pick 5 more people. And by the way, you could have overlapping, so you can even randomly choose 2 people from the first one, or even 4 people from the first sample, along with one other. As long as one person changed, you got a unique sample there. Okay, so there's a lot of unique samples there. Okay, well, every one of those samples, every one of those combinations had exactly the same chance of being selected to represent the population. Okay, and that would be a simple random sample. All right. Now, here's the thing: is that you got to get a list of the entire population. Okay, and then randomly pick, probably with a computer, these people or things. Okay, and this is the gold standard for random samples. However, there is a problem with it. Okay, there is a problem with it. The problem with this is that it's very hard to accomplish because you need a list of the entire population. Okay, usually populations are quite large, and to get a list of everybody is really tough. If you can achieve it, great. If you can't, well, you can't do a simple random sample then. You might have to go to one of those other methods that we talked about. Now, would a researcher like to do this? Yes. Can they always do it? No. So they revert to other things. There are all these other ones will also be random, okay, but um, they uh, uh, they just go about it differently. All right. So we have a stratified sample. All right. Here, the researcher purposely takes the population and divides it into groups called strata. Okay. So the groups are going to be called strata. And so why? Well, we don't want one group to possibly dominate the sample or be underrepresented. Okay, so so like for a political poll, all right, we take a random sample from each strata. Meaning, in our example here, if you think about it, we have what? We have Democrats, we have Republicans, and we have Independents. Okay, and so we want to represent each one of these groups correctly in our sample, and so we want the sample to sort of look like the population. So if we had, say, 45% Democrats, 45% Republicans, and 10% independents, well, fine. If we know that, let's try to make our sample look roughly like that. Okay, it doesn't have to be exact, but it should be close. Okay, why? So we don't underrepresent any one of the groups, or for that matter, overrepresent one of the groups. Okay. So the researcher purposely does this, okay, to make sure that we got a nice split between these different groups, okay, stratification. Now, there's another thing that we could do. We could do a cluster sample. So with think of this is that it's possible uh, that this happened in the past. Is that let's say that there was a house here, there's a house here, there's a house here, and think of these different blocks right here uh, as city blocks. Okay, so each one of these bars right here represents a city block. So we got all these houses everywhere, right? So houses over here, right? And so way back when, before communication was easy, uh, if you were going to do a sample, a simple random sample, you would have to go around to the entire city, and first you had to have a list of everybody. You would have had to take a random sample, And then you would have to go around to probably the entire city and go find these people. So you may have had a house right here, you may have had a house right there, a house down here, one house over here, maybe nothing over in these two, and so on and so forth. And so you would be going around this entire huge city trying to find these people to do uh, a simple random sample. And they said, oh boy, that's pretty inefficient. Okay, so uh, so what's going to happen here is that we're going to randomly choose clusters instead, okay? And that all the people or things in the chosen clusters are going to get sampled, okay? So let's go through this, okay? Let's go through an example here. Let's assume that clusters 3, 5, 6, 8 were chosen. And so we would start number these city blocks or these clusters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And so on and so forth. 6, 7, 8. And so those clusters were randomly chosen. And so what would happen then is that we pretty much would ignore those other city blocks. Okay, we would ignore all the people on those other city blocks, those other clusters, and then everybody on in these chosen clusters would get sampled. Okay, and so that's important. All right, it's important because um, students get mixed up between cluster sampling and stratification. Stratification, um, the researcher purposely divides uh, uh, the population into groups, and then we randomly choose from those groups to create our sample. Here, that is not happening. We randomly choose clusters, and then everyone in the chosen clusters gets sampled. Okay, and so remember, that is different than our stratification. Okay. All right. Systematic sample. Often done in manufacturing. Okay. When there's obvious order to things, where things get numbered off, like say an assembly line, you can maybe do a systematic sample then. You start with a small number, random number, I should say, because all this has to be done randomly, all these sampling techniques. Okay. So you start with a small random number. For example, you randomly start the day and you pick the number 3, okay? That means you will sample the third item that comes off the conveyor belt, okay? Predetermined ahead of time, you may maybe sample the next 100th thing, next 500th thing, or maybe the next 1,000th thing or item, okay? Let's say uh, that the obvious thing to do is to choose the 1,000th item, okay? And so let's pretend that you got to have a really cool job and you got to randomly sample Hershey Kisses. Okay. Now here's the thing about Hershey Kisses is that what do you expect from a Hershey Kiss when you look at a Hershey Kiss? You expect it to have a certain size, a certain shape, that it's wrapped in that thin foil, a certain taste, and so on and so forth. Okay. And so Hershey, I'm sure, randomly samples the Hershey Kisses as they come off the conveyor belt to make sure that everything looks right, okay? Because they don't want to make a whole bunch of Hershey Kisses that are wrong, okay? They don't want to destroy all that stuff and have to start all over again, okay? And so, Hershey might go say, all right, let's take the third one off the conveyor belt. Let's take the 1,003rd. Let's take the 2,003rd. Let's take the 3,003rd Hershey Kiss and make sure that we don't have a problem as we move on through the day. Okay, maybe there's something uh, uh, increasingly going on the uh, um, with the machines that are creating the Hershey Kisses. Okay, and okay, it's okay for this one right here, the third one. Uh, it's okay for this one, but we see that maybe it's gotten a little bit smaller, but still within specifications. Now it's gotten a little bit smaller, and maybe by the time we get to here, we say, okay, they're still good, but we got a problem with our machines. And instead of making a bunch of Hershey Kisses that are out of specifications, we stop the machine right here and say, let's adjust, okay? And they go ahead and adjust their machines. And so this might be what they do to sample their products, okay? Uh, by the way, not every sampling technique. I shouldn't say every random sample is just one of these. You can have a combination of some of these too. Okay, so political polling, it's actually a combination of this stuff a lot of times. Okay, and not just stratification. Okay, but you probably can understand where that might come into play, especially in political polling. Okay, that's called multi-stage sampling. So you might combine different techniques over different stages of the sampling process. Okay, so that ends chapters, these two chapters. All right, thank you for your time.